What if infertility wasn't always a medical puzzle, but a question our ancestors knew how to answer, long before modern medicine knew where to begin? Today, infertility is approached with modern science, monitored, measured, medicated. Eggs are harvested, wombs outsourced, surrogacy reigns, scripted by science, priced by the privileged. But before medicine whispered of IVF and IUI, African societies, without stethoscopes or scalpels, crafted alternative paths to parenthood, rooted not in clinics but in culture, communal agreement, and grounded in the pulse of the earth beneath their feet. This is not just a story of the past, it is a blueprint, a sacred architecture, forgotten but not lost. Welcome to the quiet genius of Igbo traditional surrogacy. In traditional Igbo society, birth was never just biology. It was the echo of continuity, the return of the departed, the future, crowning the present with eternity. When the womb stayed silent, the question wasn't, what is wrong with her? But, what must be done to reopen the path between ancestors and descendants? Childlessness was ancestral absence, a closed door refusing passage between worlds. Still, our people did not surrender. They turned to tradition, to the wisdom of elders, to the rhythm of community and spirit. Because in Igbo land, a child could arrive through more than one door, each one sacred, ritually sanctioned, communally sealed. Long before surrogacy existed in medical syllables and was bound by legal contract, it existed here, not as experiment, but as understanding, as answer. It wasn't clinical, it was communal, relational, structured, not by white coats, but by sacred custom. What modern science defines as one carrying a child for another was already practiced, not in secrecy, but in the open, before the community, before the shrine. There were three such paths, three culturally sanctioned forms, three doors into destiny. Each path answered a question even modern medicine still wrestles with. What happens when a child is needed but cannot come through the expected path? These were not acts of desperation. They were acts of preservation, honoring the dignity of womanhood, the necessity of lineage, and the sanctity of continuation. Let us walk through them, not as outsiders, but as inheritors of a buried brilliance. To understand why these paths mattered, we must first understand how the Igbo viewed childbirth itself. In Igbo thought, childbirth was never a solo affair. It was not just biology, it was cosmic alignment, a convergence of spirit, breath, and destiny. A child was not simply born. They arrived, carrying memory in their bones and purpose in their cry. They were not strangers to the earth, but echoes of those who once walked it. Birth was a threshold, a sacred crossing between realms, a doorway opened by ancestral will. Lineage was never just personal fulfillment, it was communal inheritance. A man was expected to leave behind more than memory. He was to leave descendants, living proof that he once walked the earth, that he loved, that he labored, that he passed on the breath he once received. But what if death came too soon, before fathering enough children, or any at all? Such a death left a fracture, not just of the heart, but of the bloodline. The response was not simply mourning, it was restoration. The widow could take a wife, not for love, but for legacy, a union blessed by the community, with one sacred purpose: children born in the name of the deceased, to carry his name and to ensure that his name endured. With her husband's family's blessing and support, she would marry a young woman of childbearing age, pay the bride price, perform other required marriage rites, with witnesses present. But it was not the widow who lay with her. A chosen kinsman, trusted and discreet, would father the children. Yet these children bore not his name, but the name of the departed, whose spirit still lingers, as heirs, as legacy, rooted in the land, honored in ritual, living proof of lineage. They poured libation to his spirit, standing in his ancestral shadow. There was no scandal, no shame, no whispers, only reverence. This was the wisdom of Igbo society, where continuity outweighed convention and lineage stretched beyond the grave. A man's death did not silence his name, not when his widow could turn mourning into memory, and memory into new life. Yet continuity didn't always wait for death. Sometimes it faced the quiet ache of delay, where life moved forward, but children did not come. What if the man still lives? What if the wife is strong and willing, yet her womb remains silent? In Igbo land, a woman's worth was never measured by childbirth alone. She could be a trader, a negotiator, a spiritual voice in the community. Yet, when it came to legacy and inheritance, children, especially sons, remained central. And when conception delayed too long, the question wasn't what's wrong with her, but rather, how do we preserve his name? If medicine failed, if prayers lingered unanswered, if the cradle stayed empty for too long, she could bring in another woman, young, fertile, for the survival of the household. But this was not a typical polygamous union. It was surrogacy, a womb lent under the authority of the woman it served. The union was led by the wife, who selected the woman, negotiated bride price, and performed the marriage rites in her stead. She did not lose her place. She rose to become sponsor, guide, and an honored matriarch. The younger wife was no rival, but an extension of the first, together forming one maternal unit. The children born from that womb belonged to her in spirit, custom, and law. A womb may have stayed silent, but her arms cradled them first. This system removed shame from barrenness, replacing it with structure. It refused to let sorrow consume the home, offering a path that kept love, respect, and lineage intact. It was no secret. It was sacred. It was reproductive planning, long before the phrase was coined. But preservation wasn't always about inability. Sometimes it was about improvement, about the future outgrowing the past. Now picture this. The man lives, the woman is fertile, but the question isn't, can they conceive? It is, should his traits be passed on? Before sperm banks, before DNA edits, and designer babies, there existed a third path, quiet, intentional, and deeply cultural. A trait-based surrogacy, born not of scandal, but of sacred foresight. In traditional Igbo thought, appearance carried weight, height, strength, beauty, vitality, not vanity, but vision, a survival code encoded in the body. So what happens when a man, though fertile, looks in the mirror and feels unease with what he sees of himself? Too short, too frail, too sickly, and he wonders, can I give my bloodline a better chance than I had? In this rare but not unheard of moment, a man could initiate a quiet contract. First, he would speak to his wife, then consult the elders, and finally, seek ritual clearance. For without it, the act was taboo, a spiritual stain that could haunt generations. But with ancestral approval, it became something else entirely, a contracted seed. He would select a distant kinsman, tall, strong, healthy, and bearing the traits he desired for his lineage. His approach would be clear, respectful, deliberate. The wife would engage him, once ritually sanctioned, not for pleasure, but for the future of their bloodline. An act bound by spirit and discretion, sealed with kola nut, palm wine, and ancestral witness. The seed giver would return to silence, his name never spoken, his role forever closed. But the husband, the one who sought the path, would raise the child with quiet pride, as father, as protector, as name giver. This rare and sacred path revealed a truth ancient Africa understood. Sometimes, legacy must outweigh pride, and love, at its purest, demands the surrender of ego for the sake of the future. It was a decision made not in shame, but in wisdom, guided by tradition, sanctioned by spirit, and rooted in the duty to continue the name. Few knew of it, fewer spoke of it, but it existed, a quiet reminder that fatherhood isn't always the giver of seed, but the keeper of name. In traditional Igbo settings, as it matters to continuity, women were never invisible in the sacred architecture of lineage. A barren woman was not discarded. A widowed woman was not erased. Paths were made to keep them within the fold, to ensure the circle remained unbroken. Likewise, a man was not always the final authority. If his seed threatened the future, another's could be chosen, not in shame, but in service to continuity. Gender, within this context, was sacred and fluid. Masculine energy guided the name, feminine energy delivered it. Together, in ritual harmony, they formed the womb of the future. None of these surrogacy practices existed outside spiritual protocol. Nothing was random, nothing done in haste. Every act followed sacred order. Through the elders, the custodians of tradition, through ancestral rites that cleansed, blessed, and bound. It was never just about having a child. It was about preserving balance, restoring lineage, and honoring the unseen laws that govern life. And at the center of it all was consent. The widow had to agree, the helper had to agree, the wife had to agree, even the substitute seed giver had to agree. Nothing was hidden. For what is hidden festers and rots the lineage. But what is witnessed, blessed, and bound becomes medicine for generations. When brought into the open, when sanctified by ritual, even the most unusual arrangements could become sacred ground. Today, we marvel at test tubes, at incubators, at sperm banks and frozen embryos. We call it progress. And yes, they are powerful. But let us not forget, our ancestors faced the same questions and answered them without laboratories. They solved with wisdom, with ritual, with social design, with ancestral imagination. They knew what science is only beginning to recall, that motherhood is not just gestation, that fatherhood is not only genetics, that a child is never born to two alone, but to the land, the lineage, and the ancestors. Science offers precision. Tradition offered protection. Both hold power, but only one remembers the spirit. A womb may carry a child, but it is the village that births a legacy. Long before we placed our faith in machines to create life, we trusted one another. We trusted ritual. We trusted spirit. So let no one say Africa was backward. We were layered. We were literate in life. And above all, we made room for silence, for spirit, for solutions, for the future. If this story stirred something in you, like, subscribe, share. Let us restore dignity to the names buried beneath misunderstanding. Comment below. Tradition is technology. Ritual is remedy. Let the world know Africa had answers.